Hi, and welcome to this lecture where we're going to talk about sodium and its effect on blood pressure and heart disease risk. So we're going to look at the role of sodium in foods and food processing. If it's so bad for heart disease risk, then why is it in everything that we eat? We'll look briefly at sodium deficiency, which is not really even a thing in the general population, but you may see in clinical practice. And we'll talk more about sodium excess. We'll look at the primary sources of dietary sodium and then just review a little bit about the research and the guidelines about how we counsel people on how much sodium a day they should eat, because there's a lot of controversy surrounding that topic. Now, just a little bit of a backgrounder on sodium, okay? Table salt is sodium chloride, NaCl, okay? And sodium chloride is 40% sodium and 60% chloride. Okay, so if you take a teaspoon of salt, so you poured table salt out of your salt shaker at home, in that teaspoon, okay, because 40% of that is sodium, that equates to about 2,400 milligrams of sodium. So you're going to hear a lot about 23 and 2,400 milligrams of sodium today. Just keep that in the back of your mind that that's the equivalent of 1 teaspoon of salt. Okay. Now, what is the benefit of salt? For those of you that cook, you're clearly aware that sodium is the cheapest preservative out there. Okay, so it's been used for generations to preserve food, but also to flavor food, because it does add flavor to our foods. In our bodies, sodium plays a role in helping to maintain fluid balance and also conducts nerve impulses and may help with the absorption of some nutrients, for example, glucose. Now, sodium deficiency, as I mentioned in the intro, is extremely rare. Those who are at risk include people who are on very restrictive low sodium diets, okay, anyone who has excessive sweating, some particular athletes, okay, but also if you have persistent vomiting and or diarrhea, of course you're losing lots of fluid and electrolytes and would be at risk for hyponatremia. Symptoms include muscle cramps, nausea and vomiting, dizziness, shock, and coma. Okay, another population who suffers or who is at risk for sodium deficiency would be endurance athletes who have not properly trained with regards to replenishment of hydration, and if they drink way too much water, okay, that overcompensating for sodium losses, of course they would dilute blood sodium levels, and that could lead to a dangerous situation as well. What we're much more likely to see in the typical population, of course, is going to be sodium excess. Okay, sodium excess is tied to increased urine output, which can actually increase dehydration risk. Okay, in individuals who are prone to high blood pressure, it can cause hypertension. Okay, a question you get a lot from your younger patients who maybe don't have high blood pressure yet is, hey, I'm a healthy, active person and I don't have blood pressure issues. Is it really a problem if I eat a ton of sodium? And I tell most people, if you're actually an active person, then no. Okay, because exercise is the antidote to high sodium intake. Okay, but most people in their heads think they exercise a lot more than they actually do. And they also think they eat a lot less sodium than they actually do. And you look at your typical younger population, okay, people who are eating out at restaurants a lot and preparing very little of their actual foods, who have desk jobs and are largely sedentary. Okay, if you're establishing those patterns earlier in life, okay, as you get older and your blood pressure naturally increases, you actually could be putting yourself at risk if you have this affinity for a very high sodium diet. Okay, and sodium is an acquired taste. You sometimes people hear say, oh, I'm addicted to salt. There's no such thing as salt addiction. Okay, it's an acquired taste. And you can actually retrain and resensitize your taste buds to sodium in as little as 6 weeks. Okay, and it's a really cool experiment to try out on someone who's highly motivated is, listen, you eat a bunch of salt right now and you want to get yourself out of it? Stop eating processed food, stop eating packaged food, stop eating fast food, and don't have a salt shaker in your house. Okay, and get on that strict regimen, and I guarantee you that in a period of 6 weeks, if you went back to eating the way you did yesterday, you would be so disgusted by the high levels of sodium in the foods that you eat, because in as little as 6 weeks, you can actually resensitize your taste buds. Okay, so no one's addicted to salt, it's an acquired taste. Now, the upper limit, okay, in the DRIs, the dietary reference intakes, is set at 2,300 milligrams a day. And if you recall, the upper limit is that limit for which we have data to suggest that if you habitually go above that level, you're going to see negative consequences. Now, what's ironic is that on the food label, okay, which is governed by a totally different government agency, the FDA, the daily value for sodium is 2,300 milligrams. Okay, so on one hand, you have the FDA saying you can safely go up to 2,300 milligrams. And on the other hand, you have the IOM saying, oh no, the UL is 2,300 milligrams. And if you go above that, you're dead in the water. So there's a lot of I don't say misconception, but there's a lot of conflict and a lot of controversy about exactly how much sodium we should be eating. Okay, but at the end of the day, it's kind of a moot point because the typical American eats well above 3,000 milligrams a day. So we certainly have room for improvement for what we can do as a society with regard to our sodium intake. So how much do we need? Again, another loaded question. Okay, the DRI says that adults up to age 70, quote unquote, need 1,300 milligrams a day. Now, it's documented you could certainly live with less than that, okay? But the point is you need some sodium in your diet, to do all the things that sodium does internally. Adults over that age, 71 plus, it goes down a little bit to 1,200 milligrams. The reference on the previous page, that was the UL, meaning don't go above 2,300 milligrams. That's also a DRI value. Now, in 2015, remember, the dietary guidelines were reissued, okay? And there was a slight change in the wording about sodium recommendations. And basically, the 2015 dietary guidelines say that the general population would benefit from limiting their sodium to 2,300 milligrams a day or less. Now, they go on to say that there's a caveat that people of hypertension and pre-hypertension may benefit and experience a greater blood pressure reduction if they lower it to 1,500 milligrams a day. This was a pretty marked departure from the previous guidelines, which were in 2010, that said basically there's all these high-risk groups that should definitely be eating less than 1,500 milligrams a day. The IOM and a lot of other groups have really backed off of these super low sodium recommendations for certain subpopulations because there's no data to suggest that that actually has improvements or yields improvements, because to be honest, nobody ever eats that minimal amount of sodium. Okay, and it's really hard to get people to do that, even in a controlled environment like a controlled research study. The typical American eats 3,400 milligrams a day. So remember, there's 2,400 milligrams of sodium in a teaspoon of salt. The typical American is eating more than that. Okay, and on the food label, the daily values are changing with the new food label that's being put out. And so it went from 2,400 to 2,300 milligrams a day. It's kind of a very minor detail, but now the daily value on the food label is in line with what the upper limit is from the DRIs. Okay, so where does sodium come from in our diet? Contrary to popular belief, the salt shaker is not the primary source of sodium in the diet. You have patients all the time who, once you start talking about sodium, they kind of tune out. I literally had a patient tell me once, "Oh, honey, I haven't had a salt shaker in my house for decades. I don't have a problem with that." And then you ask her what she's eating, and it's canned soup and crackers and packaged foods and fast food, okay? The primary sources of sodium in the U.S. diet are packaged and processed foods, frozen foods, and fast food, okay? And not frozen foods like frozen vegetables, okay? Frozen foods like Hungry Man meals and frozen dinners. Okay, canned foods, obviously another source, and anything that has like kind of added sauces and condiments can be a huge source. And actually breads are pretty high in sodium too. If you've ever had to be on a sodium restricted diet, it's really challenging to find a tasty bread that doesn't have a ton of sodium. If you bake, you need a little bit of salt for leavening, but you don't need nearly as much salt as most of the bread products that we see on our markets today have. It's used primarily as a preservative in that case. So what foods are low in sodium? Okay, fruits and vegetables, whole grains, meats without sauces, and unprocessed foods. Generally, the less processed a food is, the less sodium it will have in it. 40% of sodium in the U.S. diet comes from these 10 types of foods. Okay, this is a statistic that's cited really regularly. It's from a CDC analysis of dietary sodium intake in the U.S. It's breads and rolls, cold cuts and cured meats, pizza, fresh and processed poultry, because a lot of poultry processors will inject the chicken with sodium, which plumps it up. You're buying poultry by the pound, right? So you're kind of the one who loses here because you're paying more per pound and getting salt in your meat, which should be salt-free. Soups, sandwiches, cheese, pasta dishes, mixed meat dishes, and snacks. Now, when you read labels, there's lots of confusion about sodium, okay? But there's actually regulations about sodium terminology on the front of packages, but they tend to all kind of sound the same, so consumers don't really recognize that there's a difference. If something is no added salt, it means that it's usually low in sodium, but not sodium-free. If something is low sodium, it means there's less than 140 milligrams of sodium per serving. If something is reduced or less sodium, all that means is that there's 25% less sodium than you would find in the standard reference amount. So the best analogy for this one is soy sauce. Soy sauce is liquid salt. Reduced sodium soy sauce just has 25% less sodium than regular liquid salt does. Okay, people say all the time, "Oh, I'm having the low salt soy sauce." No, it's not low salt. If it was low salt, it'd have less than 140 milligrams per serving, and there's no such thing as a soy sauce that does. It's just reduced sodium, meaning there's only 25% less. Light, or light LITE, means there's at least 50% less sodium than the reference amount. You don't see that one very often. You see reduced a lot more frequently. Now, as far as the dietary factors that are related to hypertension, you can lower your risk of hypertension and lower blood pressure in people who have hypertension by increasing the amount of calcium, potassium, and magnesium in the diet. And we're going to look at the DASH diet in a separate lecture and go into more detail. People who are at risk for hypertension and those who have high blood pressure, okay, sodium and excessive alcohol in the diet are going to exacerbate the situation and make things worse. So how can we lower blood pressure? Okay, it's a combination of a number of diet and lifestyle factors. Losing excess weight, following the DASH diet, which we'll introduce in a separate lecture, exercising daily, limiting sodium, and limiting alcohol. You can see that the cumulative effect of those is equivalent to what you see on the right-hand side in that column. You add that all up, there can be a significant drop in systolic blood pressure, oftentimes greater than that which you would realize with antihypertensive medication. As far as research on sodium and blood pressure goes, in 2013, the Institute of Medicine released a report entitled Sodium Intake in Populations, Assessment of Evidence. And in this study, this report, they analyzed 38 different scientific studies. 34 that were observational and 4 that were RCTs. Okay, and what the IOM basically said is that there is no evidence to support treating population subgroups differently from the general population. Okay, so there's really no benefit from lowering sodium intake below 2,300 milligrams a day. Okay, and that's a pretty big deviation from what they had said earlier. In the 2010 dietary guidelines, there was a sub-recommendation that said, okay, general population, yeah, you guys eat 2,300 milligrams or less. Yeah, right, nobody does that. But there's these other populations that need to eat 1,500 milligrams a day or less. And again, this is from the 2010 dietary guidelines. So now no longer in effect because they've been replaced with 2015. But in 2010, the thinking was, okay, people who are African American, people who have diabetes, kidney disease, or hypertension, and everyone age 51 or older in the United States needs to eat 1,500 milligrams of sodium or less. Well, guess what? If you add up those high-risk populations, African Americans, people with diabetes, kidney disease or hypertension, and people over 51, that was more than 50% of the US population. Okay, so the dietary guidelines are so far removed from what people actually do. You're saying that 50% or more of the US population, who, by the way, eats 3,400 milligrams a day, needs to eat 1,500 milligrams or less? Again, there's no real research to support that. And so this study that came out after that in 2013 really kind of laid the groundwork for what the 2015 dietary guidelines were, which is, hey, listen, let's just stick with a general recommendation of 2,300 because that's actually a lot less than your typical person is going to be eating today.